It's the spring of 2001. Just before I enter the 24,000 square foot exhibition centre close to Abu Dhabi Airport, I receive an elaborate invitation on vellum parchment. It is the pleasure of His Highness Sheikh Falah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Chairman of Gantut Racing and Polo Club, to cordially invite you for the final of the IDEX Al Basti Polo Tournament at 7:30 p.m, followed by dinner. Formal dress. A few minutes after I've cleared the security gates, I am offered a fine Persian silk carpet and, at a mercifully smaller price, a set of Arab brass cooking utensils and coffee pots. The Arabs wear their white robes with dignity, the Western visitors dark blue suits and ties, their wives bright, tight-fitting dresses, often with those slightly silly racing hats that come with purple stalks and fake blossoms on top. Several of the ladies drop off to look at the jewellery shop with its gold bangles and rings. One of Sheikh Mohammed's military pipe bands plays English and Scottish marches. Smartly attired Indian and Pakistani workers labour to erect Arab tents before the midday sun reaches its height. Polo, silk carpets, coffee pots, flowers, a Highlander's lament, and tea and jewellery. It is as civilised as fine art, which is what the sale of weapons has become for the world's armourers. For behind the tents and trinket shops, in this vast compound in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, there lay on display some of the most sophisticated and the most lethal ordnance ever made by man. So new, you could smell the fresh paint gleaming in the sun. So clean, so artistically bold in their design that you might never guess their purpose. And each time I wandered over to examine a French missile, a German tank, an American Hellfire rocket, a British armoured vehicle, a Dutch self-propelled gun, a shelf of Italian pistols, a Russian automatic rifle, a South African army video screen of crimson explosions, up would come a charming gentleman in another of those dark blue suits, a merchant of death, brandishing a file of glossy, expensively produced brochures, offering a powerful handshake and another cup of tea. Occasionally, they were a bit portly. Selling death on a large scale means a lot of hospitality. And often they carried a small purple or blue flower in their buttonhole. Ballistics was their fascination. As the day warms up, the bullet grows faster. It flies faster, a cheerful Australian confided to me. In the evening, the air grows heavier and the bullet goes more slowly. Smiling field marshals and jolly generals from across the Arab world drifted through the arms pavilions, peering through sniper rifles, clambering like school children onto howitzers and tanks, running their hands repeatedly along the sleek missile tubes, masturbating the instruments of death. I have to admit a grim fascination of my own in all this, a professional interest. For 25 years now, the crudest and most fabulously designed bullets, rockets, missiles, tank shells, artillery rounds and grenades have been hurled in my direction by some of the nastiest and most moral armies on earth. Israelis with American Hellfire air-to-ground missiles, Syrians with Russian T-72 tanks, RAF pilots with American cluster bombs, Afghan Mujahideen with Russian AK-47 rifles, Russians with Hind helicopter gunships, Iraqis and Azerbaijanis with Russian-manufactured Scud rockets, and Iranians with US-made sniper rifles, and Americans with Boeing fighter bombers and battleships whose shells were the size of Volkswagens. They have all sent their produce swishing in my direction. Even as I walk between the immaculate stands of this exhibition, the tinnitus hisses viciously in my ears from that Iraqi 155mm gun that so seriously damaged my hearing back in 1980. In a quarter of a century, I've seen thousands of corpses, women and children as well as men, blasted, shredded, eviscerated, disemboweled, beheaded, lobotomized, castrated, and otherwise annihilated by the multi-billion-dollar arms industry. Almost all of them were Muslims. This is a symbol of our triumph over the Middle East in Abu Dhabi this hot March day of 2001. Our ability to kill Muslims and to help Muslims kill other Muslims with our weapons. They have no weapons to touch us. Not yet. Not for another 6 months. I regularly prowl the arms bazaars of the Middle East, seeking an answer to the same old questions. Who are the men who produce this vile equipment? How can they justify their trade? How will the victims respond to this pulverization of their lives? What language can compass science and death and capital gains on such a scale? For there is, I was to discover in Abu Dhabi, an integral, frightening correlation between linguistics and guns, between grammar and rockets. It's all about the words. Thus, I circle the arms sellers' pavilions with a large canvas bag and a kleptomaniac's desire to hoard every brochure, pamphlet, book and magazine, squirreling away thousands of pages of the stuff. And back in my tiny hotel room, I rifle through the lot. The Russians are mildest in their language. You will feel protected by our smart weapons shield, promises Russia's KEP Instrument Design Bureau. Ural Vagonkavod's latest T-90 tank is advertised simply as the best. Ulyanovsk Mechanical Plant's anti-aircraft missiles give an awesome punch to their buyers. The British are smoother. Vickers Defence Systems are trying to flog the new Challenger 2E tank, optimised to represent the best balance of fightability, firepower and mobility. Its ability to deliver combat effectiveness has been proven. Well, yes, I recall. The earlier Challenger 2 was used by our chaps in the Gulf. And the Challengers fired, I remember, depleted uranium munitions. Proven indeed. Australian defence industries are selling a live-fire defence training system which includes a ruggedised portable unit. This is taken right to the battlefield so that soldiers can practice shooting computerised human beings in between killing real ones. Target movers, a real favourite of mine these, were able to respond to programmable functions including appear on command, fall when hit, reappear after hit, hold up to accept and count automatic fire, and bob to cycle up and down as desired until hit. The Italians like their verbal trumpets. Beretta firearms provide quality without compromise, experience, innovation, respect for tradition, the Beretta tradition of excellence. The compact size and potent calibers of Beretta's new 9000S Type F pistols are developed to deserve your trust. Benelli, which like Beretta makes hunting guns, promotes its animal killer as black, aggressive, highly technological. Benelli's pump-action shotgun is described as gutsy in character. Finland's Sarco 75 hunting gun manufacturers boast that their designers have been asked a simple question. What would you do if given the resources to design the rifle of your dreams, the new ultimate rifle for the new millennium? And later, of course, just a few months later, I will look at this question again and wonder what Osama bin Laden would have said, or did say, if or when he was asked to design the weapon of his dreams, the new ultimate weapon for the new millennium. Excellence crops up again and again in the brochures. Oshkosh of Wilmington manufactures military trucks with a tradition of excellence. The company's produce, grounded in history, focused on another century. Then comes Boeing's Apache Longbow attack helicopter. It's easy to talk about performance, their ad runs. Only Apache Longbow delivers. The European Aeronautic Defence and Space Company are among the few to let the cat out of the bag. True respect, their advertising brags, can only be earned by making superior weapon systems. Only by owning them. In 1906, in George Bernard Shaw's play Major Barbara, the armourer, Andrew Undershaft, said exactly that. Asked whether he would choose honour, justice, truth, love and mercy, or money and gunpowder, Undershaft replies, money and gunpowder, for without enough of both, you cannot afford the others. I begin to feel a little sick. There is something infinitely sad and impotent about the frightful language of the merchants of death. But worse is to come. Bofors, from peace-loving Nobel-awarding Sweden, is a provider of technologies for a safer future, reliable and innovative. Pakistan ordnance factories make ammunition chiselled to perfection. Mowag, from peace-loving Cuckoo Clock Switzerland, manufactures a Piranha 3 armoured personnel carrier with a family concept for many mission role variants. But Lockheed Martin of Dallas scoops them all with a winning portfolio of missiles and bombers, the timeless Fighting Falcon F-16 fighter, new target acquisition systems that are the brains and brawn of Lockheed's Apache helicopters, the F-22 Raptor, a new breed of superfighter that will dominate the skies and bring unequaled capability to US fighter pilots, the Javelin fire and forget missile that will give maximum gunner survivability, and the new multiple launch rocket system that the Iraqis, in their terror, called Steel Rain in 1991. Lockheed actually quotes the Iraqis, and which gives its users a shoot and scoot capability. Shoot and scoot was General Norman Schwarzkopf's sneering description of the supposedly cowardly Iraqi Scud missile gunners. No reminder of that here. And so the glossy magazines pile up on my bedroom floor. It is a linguistic journey into a fantasy world. Half the words used by the arms sellers, protection, reliability, optimization, excellence, family, history, respect, trust, timelessness and perfection, invoked human virtues, even the achievements of the spirit. The other half, punch, gutsy, performance, experience, potency, fightability, brawn and breed were words of naked aggression, a hopelessly infantile male sexuality to prove that might is right. The only thing they didn't mention was death. And when I went to talk to the men who were in Abu Dhabi to turn $1 on all these weapons, they were as innocent, as squeaky clean, as nice a bunch of middle-class men as you could meet. At the Vickers Pavilion stands Derek Turnbull from Blythe in Northumberland, watching a scale model of the Challenger 2E tank moving eternally round and round on a plastic stand. Ask him if he ever thinks about what all these weapons do to human beings, and his response is immediate. Anyone who says no is a liar. Any civilized person who works in this business knows what the purposes are. But we're more hidebound than anyone else. Large exports like this are strictly controlled by the British government. But then Mr. Turnbull added a strange remark. You have to remember that a tank is to kill tanks, not people. That's the purpose of it. Now, Derek Turnbull is an intelligent as well as a friendly man. Is he really satisfied with a comment like that? Aren't there humans, some mother's sons inside a tank when it is killed? Does he really think they survive when a British shell chews its way through the armour? Turnbull talks about the detachment that comes with military information technology. Everyone comes to terms with it in their own way. Most people talk about the engineering and the technology. It is mentioned from time to time. The it, of course, is the infliction of death, although at no point does he use the word. Then it turns out that he was in Saudi Arabia for Vickers during the Gulf War of 1991, and that although he was not a soldier, he arrived at the infamous Road of Death south of Basra within 2 days of the mass slaughter of fleeing Iraqis by American and British pilots, looking down upon the killing fields in which fleeing women also died from the Mutla Ridge. Turnbull is thoughtful when he talks about this. It was horrendous. But in a funny sort of way, I didn't have the reaction I'd expected. You see, we'd driven up through Kuwait, through all the oil wells that had been set alight by the Iraqis. It was the most awful thing I'd ever seen. And by the time I'd gone through all this awful devastation, I wasn't too shocked by the damage at Mutla. We were silent for a while. The damage at Mutla was human as well as material. I remembered the Iraqi soldier I found squashed flat in the sand. His whole body, just an inch thick. The burning oil fields were awesome, but human death was surely something different. Turnbull, and it must be said that he seemed to enjoy my questions, then turned into the archetypal arms salesman. Look, Robert, if the world was full of nice human beings who did civilized things, we wouldn't need all this kit. But the weapon that had long haunted my imagination, and that will come to be the villain of this chapter, is called Hellfire, an anti-armour weapon used for years by the Israelis in Lebanon and more recently in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. It was a Hellfire 1 fired by an American-made Israeli Apache which was targeted into a Lebanese ambulance in 1996, killing 4 children and 2 women on board. The Hellfire occupied pride of place on the Lockheed Martin stand, and 69-year-old Vice President John Hurst was its expert, though he said he hadn't heard about the ambulance. As I sat in the Lockheed Pavilion, John Hurst, 45 years with Lockheed, outshafted undershaft. From a religious point of view, I'm a very strong Christian. I'm Episcopalian. You can look through the entire New Testament and you won't find anything on defending yourself by zapping the other guy. But the Old Testament, that's something different. There's plenty there that says God wants us to defend ourselves against those that will strike us down. In the New Testament, it says the Lord wants us to preach his gospel. And we can't very well do that if we're dead. That's not an aggressive posture. The guy that wants to hurt me has to think twice. The Lord wants us to defend ourselves and arm ourselves so that we can spread his word. But death, I ask him? Death? Right or wrong, I never associate it with what I'm doing. If I see a bomb go off and legs flying off, I never say to myself, I could have been the cause of that, because we're trying to prevent that. Sometimes some wacko wants to torch something. When a guy like Saddam Hussein pulls the plug like that, we have no recourse. We say, here's what happens when you do that. Don't do it again. But while the Armourers peddled the linguistics of power, beauty, excellence, protection, reliability, potency and brawn, the gospel preached at Abu Dhabi had nothing to do with John Hurst's God. It was ultimately about fear and threats, the threat of Saddamite aggression, the constant reiterated warnings that these gentle, soft, sandy, unspeakably wealthy Gulf oil
Arab Gulf oil states must arm and rearm themselves against chemical, biological or nuclear attack. This grim and entirely false scenario, of course, was to become wearily familiar 18 months later when President Bush and Prime Minister Blair used exactly the same demons to propel us to war. But in Abu Dhabi, in March 2001, they were introduced entirely for commercial gain, to terrify our friends in the Gulf, to persuade them that only by purchasing billions of dollars of weaponry could they be safe. In retrospect, these tactics were a dress rehearsal for the reuse of the same inaccurate material to justify our invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yes, what was being preached at Abu Dhabi was the new George W. Bush doctrine. The threat comes from war criminal Saddam Hussein, not from peace-loving Israel. The Arabs need to defend themselves quickly, a policy that necessitates the wholesale milking of the Arab Gulf's wealth, the Arab squandering of billions of dollars on Western arms to protect the Gulf from the wreckage of Iraq and the chaos of Iran. The statistics told it all. In 1998 and 1999 alone, Gulf Arab military spending came to $92 billion. Incredibly, Philippe Roger, the French Armament Directorate's International Relations Director, announced in Abu Dhabi that while Gulf governments could consider using the higher receipts from oil for servicing their debt, we believe that higher allocations could go for defense-related spending. And if the Arab people, as opposed to their rulers, objected to this insanity, there was even available at the Arms Bazaar the means to end their protest. South Africa's SWAT clip products were advertising smoke generators for large-scale clearance operations, a 37mm baton round that neutralizes a rioter by delivering a hefty, non-lethal punch, and a 12-gauge shotgun baton to provide an accurate means of disabling selected activists. In despair, I walked to the Russian pavilion. And it was here that I met him. Indeed, I could scarcely believe that a name so notorious in all the world's wars and atrocities, so redolent of insurgency and revolution, so frequently used in battle dispatches that the very word has become a cliché of war reporting, really bore corporeal form, other than that of the AK-47, the most famous rifle in the world. It was a sign of the Russian times that to sell their tanks and MiGs, they had enlisted the help of the 81-year-old inventor of that most iconic of weapons and freighted him all the way to Abu Dhabi. I found him sitting in a small room. Mikhail Kalashnikov himself, a small, squat man with grey, coiffed hair and quite a few gold teeth, hands unsteady, but Siberian eyes, alert as a wolf, still wearing his 2 Hero of Socialist Labour medals. He, at least, is one of the very few arms sellers to have experienced war. Born in November 1919, he was one of 18 children, of whom only 6 survived. A Soviet T-38 tank commander in 1941, wounded in the shoulder and back when a German shell smashed part of the tank's armour into his body. I was in hospital, and a soldier in the bed beside me asked me, why do our soldiers have only 1 rifle for 2 or 3 of our men when the Germans have automatics? So I designed one. I was a soldier and I created a machine gun for a soldier. It was called an Automat Kalashnikova, the automatic weapon of Kalashnikov, AK, and it carried the date of its first manufacture, 1947. The AK-47 became the symbol of revolution. Palestinian, Angolan, Vietnamese, Algerian, Afghan, Hezbollah, the battle rifle of the Warsaw Pact. And I asked, old Mikhail Kalashnikov, how he could justify all this blood, all these corpses torn to bits by his invention. He had been asked before. You see, all these feelings come about because one side wants to liberate itself with arms. But in my opinion, it is good that prevails. You may live to see the day when good prevails. It will be after I am dead. But the time will come when my weapons will no more be used or necessary. This was incredible, preposterous. The AK-47 has mythic status. Kalashnikov admits this. It is not my fault that the Kalashnikov became well known in the world, that it was used in many troubled places. I think the policies of these countries are to blame, not the weapons designers. Man is born to protect his family, his children, his wife. There was only one other place to seek an answer. I walked over to a small stand hidden away in the corner of one of the farthest pavilions. This was the Iranian arms bazaar. Their missiles were called Dawn or Morning Sunrise, although one caught my eye, a big V2 look-alike 125-kilometre range monster called the Naziat. It's a Persian word meaning horror of death. Yes, Iran, the only nation in all the world's arms market to tell the true purpose of a weapon, had actually named a missile after the extinction of life. Did the answer to all my questions, I wondered, lie here? These missiles are not for sale. I was solemnly informed by Morteza Khosravi. They are only to show Iran's capabilities. Although in the year 2000, Iran had sold $31 million worth of defense products to Asia and Africa, Khosravi, a young man from the Iranian Ministry of Defense with a small beard and an intense expression, took half a minute to reflect on each of my questions before replying. There are two main purposes for the production of weapons. Some provide them for aggression, others for self-defense. The latter is the case for our country. We produce weapons only for self-defense and for the protective policy of our government. Then Khosravi uttered the mantra of every arms seller. It is a fact that each human being must defend himself. I'd heard this from Derek Turnbull, from Mikhail Kalashnikov, from John Hurst. If only the world was full of nice human beings who did civilized things. The Lord wants us to defend ourselves. Man is born to protect his family. It seemed useless to listen to these words anymore. They were unstoppable, unarguable, impossible. Now thrive the Armourers indeed. The merchants of death sell death in the form of protection, killing as defense, God's will, human destiny, patriotic duty. The bills, human and financial, come later. And we poor humans are the target movers. Frightened folk to fleece with talk of threats and aggression. The threat is inside ourselves, of course, as we travel through the world. It is our task to cycle up and down as desired until hit. It was inevitable, I suppose, that Lebanon, the land in which I've lived for half my life, should eventually provide me with that one unique and terrible connection which I had sought for so long to understand. The connection between the armourers and their ultimate victims, between the respectable weapons manufacturers and the innocents whom their weapons kill. For many years in the Middle East, I had pondered the morality of those who made the guns that killed the people around me. What long-dead Soviet worker in Stalin's or Khrushchev's Russia had manufactured the Katyusha rocket to be fired decades later by the Palestinians and the Hezbollah at the Israelis?
What technician in the United States had put together the cluster bombs that Israel rained down on civilian areas of West Beirut in 1982? What manufacturer, what developers, decent, patriotic, God-fearing Americans, no doubt, had built the Hellfire missile which an Israeli pilot fired into a Lebanese ambulance on the 13th of April 1996, killing 2 women and 4 children. 5 years later, in Abu Dhabi, John Hurst of Lockheed would tell me he had no knowledge of this frightful little bloodbath. But then Mikhail Kalashnikov told me he felt no regrets about the carnage caused by the rifle he had designed. He had invented the AK-47 not to kill the innocent, but to protect his country, the refrain of every armourer. Yet the events of the 13th of April 1996 would allow me to challenge this mantra, to take the evidence of savagery back to the men in the United States who created the instrument of death for 6 poor Lebanese civilians whose only guilt lay in their nationality, in the location of their dirt-poor village, and in the cynicism of the conflict, which had been fought in that part of the country for 21 years. In all, 150,000 men, women and children were killed in the Lebanese civil war, tens of thousands of them victims of American munitions. These 6 civilians were to die long after the war had officially ended, victims of a constantly renewable conflict between Israel's occupation army and the Lebanese Hezbollah guerrillas, who eventually drove their enemies out of almost all of Lebanon. In the months to come, I would interview all the survivors, all the witnesses, UN soldiers and Lebanese civilians, and the American arms manufacturers involved in this dreadful affair, which I still regard as a crime against humanity. The Lebanese Shia Muslim village of Mansouri lay scarcely 8 kilometres from the Lebanese-Israeli frontier, and all that morning of Saturday the 13th of April, the Israelis had shelled the area. 32-year-old Fadila al-Ogla had spent the night with her aunt, Naukal, cowering in the barn close to the village's donkeys and cows. But that Saturday, she came out of hiding, because there was no more bread in the village, and the Israeli artillery rounds were now landing between the grimy concrete houses. Abbas Jiha, a farmer who acted as volunteer ambulance driver for the Shia Muslim village, had spent the night with his 27-year-old wife Mona, their 3 small daughters, Zainab, Hanin and baby Mariam, and their 6-year-old son Mehdi, in the family's 1-room hut above an olive grove, listening to the threats broadcast by the Voice of Hope radio station, which was run by Israel in the 10% of Lebanese territory it occupied north of its border. The Israelis kept saying over the radio that the people of the villages must flee their homes, Abbas Jiha later recalled for me. They named Mansouri as one of those villages. They were telling us to escape. They were saying that they wouldn't attack the cars that were leaving the villages. And when I opened the door, I saw that the shelling was coming into Mansouri. Shortly after dawn, on 13th of April, a shell struck a house on the edge of the village, wounding Abdulaziz Mosen, a 23-year-old farmer and former Lebanese army conscript. Despite the gunfire, Abbas Jiha ran from his home to ask for the keys of the Mansouri ambulance from the village mayor. The battered, white-painted Volvo, which was a gift to the people of Mansouri from villagers who had made money after emigrating to West Africa, had 2 empty stretchers lying on the back floor, and Jiha pushed Mosen into the vehicle, setting off through the gunfire to the city of Tyre, up the Mediterranean coast to the northwest. There, he bought sacks of flat Arabic bread for the marooned villagers of Mansouri. He arrived back by 9 in the morning and was handing out the bread when another shell hit a laneway, wounding a 2-month-old baby called Ali Modehi. Back
drove Abbas Jiha once more in the old village ambulance, its blue light flashing on the roof, until he had safely delivered Ali to the Tyre hospital. He bought yet more bread for the families of Mansouri, then set off again for the village. As he did so, Najla Abu Jaja, a young Reuters camerawoman, was on an equally dangerous mission, driving through the foothills east of Mansouri in an attempt to film the Israeli air attacks for the British news agency. Unwilling to leave the battle zone, the resourceful and brave Abu Jaja headed west to a road near Mansouri where she caught sight of two more Apaches that appeared to be watching something, almost stationary in the sky, but moving a few meters backwards, then a few meters forwards. Abbas Jiha was now back in the centre of Mansouri, enveloped in the scene of mass panic. Many people had already fled their homes, but a few were left, including my own family, and the shells were falling all over the place. A jet came and dropped a bomb on the edge of the village. So I said the people could get into the ambulance and I'd take them to safety. I got Mona and our children. Abbas Jiha said that just as he put 9-year-old Zainab, 5-year-old Hanin and 2-month-old Mariam, along with their brother Mehdi, into the back of the ambulance, he saw 2 helicopters. They were low, and the pilots seemed to be watching us. Fadila al-Ogla bought 2 bags of bread from Abbas, but was herself now fearful of the planes. Although the Israelis said we would not be attacked if we fed our houses, the Apaches were strafing the road with bullets, and shells were bursting all around our homes. My brothers had left in a pickup, and other people had escaped in farm tractors. My parents told me, leave and follow your brothers. I went down to the village to look for another pickup, but then I saw Abbas Jiha driving the village ambulance with his wife and family inside. I asked if he would take me, and he said, no problem. By the time Abbas Jiha left Mansouri, he had 13 terrified passengers crammed into the vehicle. There was his wife Mona and their 4 children, Fadila and her aunt Naukal, Mohammed Hisham, a window repairman, and 5 members of the Al-Khaled family, 22-year-old Nadia, who was Naukal's daughter, and her 4 nieces, Sahar, aged 3, Aida, 7, Huda, 11, and 13-year-old Manar. Abbas Jiha and Mohammed Hisham, the only male adults, sat in the front of the ambulance along with 6-year-old Mehdi. The rest sat pressed together in the back. Abbas Jiha remembers that part of the village was now on fire, the smoke curling over the fields. We left in a convoy of tractors and cars and headed for Amriya, where there was a UN post with Fijian soldiers on the main coast road to Tyre. The shells were falling all round us in the fields. Najla Abu Jaja was herself now standing in front of the Fijian position, UN checkpoint 123, taking still pictures of refugee traffic on the road, a friend holding her video camera. There were 2 helicopters in the sky, watching the checkpoint, she told me. I was worried about those helicopters, about what they were doing there. I saw an ambulance coming down the road and thought it must have wounded on board, but then I saw it was full of women and children. There was another car moving in the opposite direction, and the ambulance driver was waving with his hand, telling it to turn back. The videotape record of those moments shows the ambulance passing the unmanned UN checkpoint. The Fijian soldiers were not on the road, but in their protective bunkers, and Abbas Jiha's hand appears at the window of his vehicle, urging the other car to stop. It was then that Abbas Jiha heard the women in the back of his ambulance shouting at him. One of them was crying out to me, "The helicopter is coming close to us, it's chasing us." I looked out of the window and I could see the Apache getting closer. I told them all, "Don't be afraid. Just say, Allahu Akbar, God is great, and the name of the Imam Ali." I had told them not to be afraid, but I was very frightened. Najla Abu Jaja saw the same helicopter. It was getting lower and nearer, and I've learned that this means the pilot is going to fire. I felt he was going to fire a missile, but I didn't imagine the target would be so close to me. I heard a sound like puff, puff, and saw a missile flying from the Apache with a trail of smoke behind it. In fact, the Israeli helicopter pilot fired 2 missiles. One was later discovered unexploded beside a neighbouring mosque, its steel cylinder, fins and nameplate still intact. Najla Abu Jaja's videotape recorded what happened to the other rocket. Milliseconds after the ambulance cleared UN checkpoint 123, the missile exploded through its back door, engulfing the ambulance in fire and smoke and hurling it 20 meters through the air into the living room of a nearby house. All Fadila al-Ogla could remember was a great heat in my face, like a blazing fire. Somehow I was outside the ambulance and I found a big barrel of water and started to wash my face from the heat. It was all I could think of, despite the screaming and the smoke. This terrible heat. It was as if someone was holding a flame in front of my eyes. Abbas Jiha was to recall how he hurled himself from the door of the ambulance just before it crashed into the house. I was terrified. I couldn't believe it. It was the end of my world. I knew what must have happened to my family. Najla Abu Jaja, trembling with fear, was now videotaping the terrible aftermath of the missile attack. Her tape shows Abbas Jiha wounded in the head and foot, standing in the road beside one of his dead daughters, weeping and shrieking, "God is great," up into the sky, towards the helicopter. I raised my fists to the pilot and cried out, "My God, my God, my family has gone." Abbas found his son Mehdi alive. Then he saw 2-month-old Mariam lying 3 meters from the ambulance. All her body had holes through it. Her head was full of metal. Najla Abu Jaja said, "I saw women and children coming out of the back of the ambulance, cowering and screaming and hiding. One man threw himself into the orchard, then came out holding 2 children by the arms. One was a little girl who was wounded and barefoot, but she was still trying to put her scarf back on. I saw a girl lying on the road with blood coming out of the top of her head. The driver was crying out, 'My children have died, God have mercy on us.' I saw another girl. She was Mana, and she had blood all over her, and she kept saying, 'My sister's head has exploded.' Still fearful that the helicopter would fire again, the pilot had clearly seen that his target was an ambulance. Najla Abu Jaja ran towards the house to find a scene which she has said will torment her for the rest of her life. I couldn't get the doors open because the vehicle was wedged in the room. But there were 3 children inside who were clearly in the last seconds of their life. It was as if they were entombed. One of them, she was hung in, collapsed on the broken window frame, her blood running in streams down the outside of the vehicle. In her last seconds, she tried to look at me, but she couldn't, because dust covered her face. Another little girl was sitting in the lap of a dead woman, wailing and crying, "Auntie, Auntie." There was a third girl who had her face covered in blood. She was sitting up and turning her head from side to side. Another had a terrible wound to her head and her neck, and she collapsed. As the children were dying one by one in front of me, I then heard a strange scraping sound. The missile had set off the windscreen wipers, and they were going back and forth against the broken glass, making this terrible noise. It will haunt me for the rest of my life.
Abbas Jihad, overwhelmed with grief, was tearing at the ambulance with his bare hands, along with UN Fijian troops from the checkpoint. I could see Hanin's back. She was cut through with holes like a mosquito net. Then I found my wife, Mona. She was so terribly wounded I couldn't recognize her face. I had lost her and 3 of my children. Mona Jiha, 9-year-old Zainab, 5-year-old Hanin, and the 2-month-old baby, Mariam, were all dead. So was 60-year-old Naukal and her 11-year-old niece, Hudu. The Israeli helicopter remained in the sky over UN checkpoint 123 for another 5 minutes. Then it flew away. Within hours, the Israelis admitted they had targeted the ambulance, but made 2 claims. That the vehicle was owned by a Hezbollah member, which was untrue, and that it was destroyed because it had been carrying a Hezbollah guerrilla, likewise untrue. If other individuals in the vehicle were hit during the attack, an Israeli spokesman said, they had been used by the Hezbollah as a cover for Hezbollah activities. There were no apologies. Yet international law demands the safeguarding of civilian lives, even in the absence, even in the presence rather, in the presence of individuals who do not come within the definition of civilians. And the claim that the vehicle had been targeted because it was believed to be owned by the Hezbollah was in some ways even more outrageous. How, the survivors asked themselves, could it be justifiable for the Israelis to slaughter the occupants of an ambulance just because they didn't like the suspected owner of the vehicle? And what kind of missile, they also asked, could home in on an ambulance, blasting it 20 meters through the air? If the Apache helicopter was American, as it most certainly was, who made the rocket that killed Naukal, Mona, and the 4 children, Zainab, Hanin, Mariam, and Huda? What were these terrible weapons that were now being used so promiscuously in Lebanon? Who sold them to the Israelis? And if it was an American company which had manufactured the missile, what conditions were attached to its sale? In the village of Mansouri, Abbas Jiha spent months ruminating upon the same question. How would the people who made this missile feel if their children were killed as mine were? He asked me. These things are meant to be used against armies, not civilians. Fadila al-Ogla was more resigned. The Americans will keep giving these weapons to the Israelis, whatever we say, she remarked to me one day in the same drafty 2-room house she had fled a year before. They don't care about us. We will continue to suffer. Which was perfectly true. Shortly after the bombing and the bombardment ended, however, UN ordnance officers searching through the wreckage of the ambulance found an intriguing clue to the missile's identity. Among fragments of twisted steel and shrapnel, a young UN liaison officer, Captain Mikael Lindvall of the Swedish Army, discovered a hunk of metal bearing most of a coded nameplate. It had come to rest a few inches from the blood-stained window frame where Hanin had died and contained the logo AGM 114C and a manufacturer's number 04939. Captain Lindvall knew that AGM stood for air-to-ground missile, and the 114C coding identified the 1.6 metre projectile as a Hellfire anti-armour missile, jointly manufactured by Rockwell International and Martin Marietta. Rockwell, now taken over by Boeing, had its missile headquarters, according to Jane's Defence Weekly, at Satellite Boulevard, Duluth in Georgia.
Martin Marietta, now part of Lockheed, was making missiles in Orlando, Florida. Those who made the missile that killed 4 Lebanese children and 2 women now had an address. Captain Lindvall duly handed over to me the fragment containing the codes. Somehow, I had to get this coded missile part to America to present it to its makers. The first question was how to get this piece of shrapnel, the vital and only proof that the ambulance had been hit by a hellfire, from Lebanon to the United States. There were no direct flights. It was not difficult to get it aboard an international flight from Lebanon to France. Sympathetic officials at Beirut Airport and in the airline brought the missile part on board my Air France flight to Paris. But explaining to American security men that I wanted to carry it all the way to Washington was going to end in journalistic disaster. The hunks of shrapnel were now no more a rocket than a piece of broken china constituted a plate. But the very word missile would cause palpitations to any US agent in the aftermath of the recent TWA disaster off New York. In 5 years' time, in late 2001, the whole exercise would have been impossible. In the end, Amnesty International, well aware of the ambulance killings in Lebanon, agreed to air freight the missile parts from Paris to their Washington office. A few days later, I flew Air France to the United States. I can remember my sense of excitement. Now, at last, I could confront the Armourers with the consequences of their profession. In Washington, I picked up the Hellfire fragment in the heart of the capital, whose alliance with Israel allows neither criticism nor restraint. I wasn't going to take a local flight and get caught on the metal detectors at Washington's Ronald Reagan Airport, so the Crescent, a railroad train en route to New Orleans, would take me through the night down to Georgia, where Bob Algarotti of Boeing had agreed to meet me to discuss the Hellfire at the very home of the missile. He wanted to explain its advantages, its combat-proven abilities to a reporter who, he wrongly assumed, wanted to write a puff piece about the missile's accuracy. When I awoke the next bright morning in my sleeping car heading south, the neat little American towns looked like they were on a Hollywood set. The soft green countryside and the clapboard houses sailed past the window of my carriage. How neat those little gardens were with their flowers and children's swings. Was I only 6,000 miles away from Lebanon? Or on a different planet? There were towns called Cornelia and Magnolia Acres flicking past, and a gun store in a land where every man, woman has the right to bear arms, called Lock, Stock and Barrel. And so many flagstaffs that dawn morning I could see from my carriage window, and so many red, white and blue American flags snapping proudly from them. There hadn't been a war in these parts, I thought, for 130 years. I climbed down at Gainesville Station, where a taxi man with one surviving tooth took me down Interstate 85 to the old Peachtree Road exit. We passed a sign saying Duluth, and then Satellite Boulevard, and then, less than 3 miles further on, we turned into a campus of discreet 2-story buildings, hidden behind tall trees and manicured lawns. Boeing Defense and Space Group, it said on the sign at the gate. It was to be a disturbing afternoon. A tiny green-painted model of the Hellfire stood on a shelf of the room in which Bob Algarotti of Boeing introduced me to 2 executives intimately involved in the production of the missile. They were highly intelligent men. Both were former serving officers in Vietnam, and both would later request anonymity for their security, it seemed, although their concern about Boeing's reaction to the interview appeared to outweigh any fear of Hezbollah or terrorism. I explained that I was interested in writing about the abilities of the Hellfire, but also about its specific use in the Middle East. The executive to my right, whom I shall call the Colonel, for that was his rank in Vietnam, produced a glossy brochure that detailed the evolution of the Hellfire modular missile system and placed it on the table between us. Page 2 carried a series of small illustrated cross-sections of the rocket, and following the dates 1982 to 1989, a coding of AGM 114A, B and C. The piece of shrapnel, which unbeknown to the Boeing men was in my camera bag, was marked AGM 114C. So the missile that killed Abbas Jiha's family, Narkal, and her niece was at least 7 years old. The Colonel listed the countries which had purchased either an early or later improved category of the Hellfire. First on the list was Israel, with both categories. "They take soldiering pretty seriously," the Colonel said admiringly, a remark I decided to let go for the moment. But Egypt, South Africa and the United Arab Emirates were also included. Sweden and Norway had purchased an anti-ship version of the Hellfire. The British had Category 2. It was a popular product, and the Colonel was keen to explain why. "It's probably the most precise anti-armour weapon in the world," he said. "You can fire it through a basketball hoop at 5 miles and it would do it every time." So the women and children in the ambulance, I thought to myself, had stood no chance. I understood at once what this meant. The Boeing men were promoting the accuracy of their weapons as part of their humanitarian pitch. The more accurate the Hellfire, the less chance civilians would be killed by it. The problem came when the weapon was aimed specifically at a civilian target, as it had been by the Israelis in Lebanon, when the very precision of the missile ensured that civilians would be killed. So I asked what checks Boeing carried out on the use to which the Hellfire had been put by the nations that purchased it. "We read the newspapers," the executives both said. I asked about Israel. "We do not get information from the Israelis about what they've done," one of the men replied. "They don't give much information." It was time to produce the missile fragment. And as I knelt to extract it from my camera bag, I felt the electricity in the air behind me. I turned round and laid the shard of iron, which had helped to kill 6 Lebanese civilians, in the centre of the table. I told all 3 men the date of its use, its location, the appalling results, and Israel's explanation. The Colonel picked it up, turning it in his hand and muttering something about how it might be too small a fragment to identify. This was absurd. He could read the codes on the metal from the missile. He understood what they meant better than I did. His colleague to my left said nothing, stared at the fragment and looked at me. Bob Algarotti, the public relations man, picked it up, glanced at his colleagues and said quietly, "Yeah, well, it's a Hellfire. We all know that." Then he said, "I'm getting a little uncomfortable." But the Colonel was angry. "This is so far off base, it's ridiculous," he said. I begged to disagree. These men manufactured this missile. Did they not bear some responsibility for its use? At least to ensure that it was used responsibly by their clients? Was reading about its use in the newspapers enough? Was that the extent of their interest or care? There then followed some very uncomfortable minutes. Algarotti complained that you couldn't blame a knife maker if someone used the knife to murder someone. "Yes," I said, "but this was not a knife. The Hellfire was an anti-personnel weapon." "It's not!" the Colonel replied angrily. "It's an anti-armour weapon!" And then there was silence. Because, of course, if the missile was an anti-armour weapon, it most surely was not an anti-ambulance weapon. Are you on some kind of crusade? One of the executives asked. I said I thought this an unfortunate remark. Algarotti interrupted quietly to agree with me. We were dealing with the death of innocent people, I repeated, including children. What was I looking for? One of the men asked. For some sign of compassion from them, I replied. One of the men said, I, as a person, sure I have feelings, but as a Boeing company employee, all we do is make missiles. I then agreed to lay down my pen on the table while the three men discussed how they could frame some statement of their feelings. Both executives clearly felt troubled about the events that I described. They were family men and wanted to express their horror at the deaths of innocents, but they didn't want Boeing involved, and equally obviously, they were frightened of criticizing Israel. During the afternoon, one man at Boeing would be heard to say twice, in identical words, I observed in my notebook, whatever you do, I don't want you to quote me as saying anything critical of Israel's policies. And here was the nub. These men, these armourers, so powerful, so overwhelmingly part of America's defense system, so patriotic in their motives, so immutably part of the history of the US armed forces in Vietnam, were frightened of offending Israel. Fearful that a mere word of criticism would damage or end their careers, or send them careening off into a political crisis within the aerospace company, so serious that their careers would be forever ravaged. Whatever you do, the man said. Then one of the executives made up his mind. Let me speak as a soldier, not as an employee of Boeing. No professional soldier is going to condone the killing of innocent people as targets. We're trained to preserve the peace. Of course, the Boeing company is troubled if its weapons are misused or targeted against, innocent people. But we build weapons systems to US requirements. We get permission to sell to many different countries. We don't sell missiles that are intended for non-military targets. I pulled from my bag the photographs that Najla Abu Jaja had taken of the victims. I laid them on the table, images of blood and torn limbs. The executive on my left looked through them with distaste. Then he said, I don't want these. And he slid the pictures of the dead and wounded members of the Jihad family across the heavily polished tabletop. The colonel looked at them and gently returned them to me. We parted with handshakes. And I felt oddly sad for these men. They were decent, hard-working, loyal employees of Rockwell, now Boeing, and they had been shocked by the story of the ambulance. They wanted to show their compassion, and did so, up to a point, but were desperately anxious to avoid any offence to Boeing or to Israel. I told them to keep the Hellfire missile fragment. I was returning it to them. And as I left the room, I heard a voice behind me say, I don't think we'll put this one in the trophy room. Thank you.